if we have time, if folks want to, we can do a Q&A if you
Yeah,
like it.
for sure. Well, as folks trickle in, just want to say welcome again to those of you who are joining us for this special presentation called Hidden in Plain Sight, a presentation facilitated by Samantha Yanity from the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center, who I will introduce in more detail soon. And welcome to those who are watching the rebroadcast of this meeting, the video recording. I hope that this is an educational experience for you all. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items for using Zoom. Most of you, all of you are on mute, and that's great. That helps kind of mitigate background noises and distractions. We ask that you remain on mute on with your microphones off unless you have a comment or question. And at that moment, you can just unmute yourselves and speak your comment to your question, and then mute yourselves again when you're finished. We will have some breakout rooms, two breakout rooms in this presentation. So you'll see a message that comes up on your screen that says to join a breakout room. You just want to make sure you click on the blue join button. And then it goes without saying, we're going to talk about sensitive issues, but important ones. So obviously, let's practice confidentiality, let's practice sensitivity, compassion, and empathy. And at the same time, practice having an open mind, right? So that we can all learn and grow and see how we can take action that's rooted in our faith. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like to formally introduce Samantha Yanity, who is the justice educator for the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center. They're actually based in Seattle. I used to live in Seattle. For those of you who don't know me, I just realized I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Danny, and I'm the social justice coordinator for St. Anthony's. I've been here for about 6 months now, and I connected with Samantha in the Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center because I used to live in Seattle, and I know that this month is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and so that's when I reached out to the IPJC and asked them to help us educate ourselves on this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic on to Samantha.
Great. Thank you, Danny, and thank you everyone for allowing me to be in this space with you all today. Um, Sorry, I just saw somebody was asking a question in the chat. If you have questions throughout the presentation, like feel free to add them in the chat, and towards the end, I can answer questions as well. So as Danny said, my name is Samantha. I am the justice educator at Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center. And one of my roles is to teach. I teach and give presentations like this to parishes, but I also do it for schools, junior high and high school. And so it's great to have these kinds of nights because I don't get to do them very often with parishioners. So I'm very excited to talk about this. Is a difficult conversation, but it's a good and enriching one. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm getting a couple of I
Yes,
can
we
hear.
can hear you, Samantha. And it
Cool.
looks like Katerina got it figured out.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure people can hear me. So let's get started. So for this first part, I'm going to have you all think about, when you think of an enslaved person, who do you imagine? And I want you to just kind of think about like what do they look like? What is their age, their race? What do they look like? What era do they live in? What country do they live in? What is their gender? Who are they? Just take a few minutes to think about these questions. And once you kind of have some of them or one of them answered, just unmute your mic and just share, and we'll just kind of take a few minutes, just shout out our ideas.
I'd say a young adult woman.
Okay, a young adult woman. Anyone else?
I think it can be anyone.
Anyone?
Children laborers in Asian countries.
What was that first part? I heard laborers and
Children laborers in
children. Okay.
India, Asia.
Like
Asia.
third world countries.
These are really great ideas. And obviously, like, none of these are, there's no right or wrong answer here. So I have another question for you. When you hear the phrase human trafficking, what do you imagine? Again, we can just shout this out. You can unmute your mic and just share.
Trucks coming over the border,
Okay.
being held against my will.
Okay. They're good answers.
Trauma.
Trauma. Let me ask you this, and you can just either just show a raise of hand or like put the hand signal in your little Zoom window. Did anybody imagine Law and Order or something like that, or like a crime show? Anybody?
Cases.
See a few hand raised, a couple thumbs up. What about this kind of image with a branded woman? Anybody imagine that? When I first heard this phrase, I either thought of Law and Order or this movie Taken with Liam Neeson, like I Got Your Daughter and I Know Who You Are. So what is the problem with these, if any, what if any, what is the problem with this kind of imagery? And someone can just unmute and share. I feel like somebody is trying to unmute themselves. I hear some background, but I don't know if anybody has any ideas.
Like that Liam guy, he looks like he's making some emergency call about looks like he's distressed.
Right. So the with these kind of images, it's not that they can't necessarily be right. There could be somebody who's like on a crime, like in these crime shows that maybe they're kidnapped or maybe they're being transported over the border. The issue sometimes is that the imageries provide some, like maybe one side of the narrative. And a lot of times when we talk about justice issues, they're like either showing one side or a sensational side. And sometimes they're capturing like one part of the story that might just share one narrative or to tell a story, right? The purpose of the media is to capture some kind of narrative to draw people in, right? So when we think and talk about human trafficking, we often have a tendency to think like maybe it's in the past and that was done, or maybe that it's not connected to the past, or it only deals with the buying and selling of sex. And sometimes people don't think that it's labor trafficking either, or we might forget that that's labor trafficking. Sometimes we think this couldn't happen in the US. We often think this couldn't happen to people who are well educated. Has anyone ever heard of the phrase? This was something that was said a lot when I was a teenager, but they might use the phrase white slavery. Is anybody familiar with that term?
Yes.
I saying yes. Was that Donna?
Yeah.
What did people say when you heard white slavery? What came to mind?
it was usually women that were being held against their will as servants, and yeah, as workers for somebody, and they came over thinking they were coming to a new life, and they came and were taken away to these people that would buy them.
Right, exactly. And so it kind of builds this like stereotype that this only happens to women of like white European descent and just women. So it kind of creates that's a false narrative as well. We think sometimes this involves just smuggling or kidnapping. And we might think this couldn't possibly happen to anyone we know, or it couldn't happen to anybody that we see on the street or on the bus. But these are all examples of how that sometimes the media shapes false narratives for us, right? So according to the International Labor Organization, there are an estimated 40 million people worldwide in the US. So here's just a few brief facts for you. So, and these are estimations, and these are kind of wide range because as most of us know that human trafficking is not legal in most countries. So that's why I titled this hidden in plain sight, because it's often hidden because it's illegal. But 4,500 to 17,500 people are trafficked annually in the US. There's been some figures that estimate that there's approximately 500,000 currently trafficked in the US, but like I said, these numbers kind of fluctuate and vary because they're not documented exactly because of the nature of this issue. Out of the people that are trafficked, so you take 40 million, 25% of those trafficked people are children. So that's and minors. So that's anyone under the age of 18. 71% of this 40 million number are women and girls. Some reports estimate that number could be larger, up to 84%. But that also shows you that there are boys and men that are trafficked too. Like as this picture shows, there are both males and females working in this field. And I'll get into a little bit more of who makes up these workers as well. So as I have in this group of pictures, we have things like pictures from the past and the present. And the reason why I did this is to kind of to show that human trafficking can be seen as just another form of slavery. If we swap out the words, we can see that this is modern day slavery, because what is happening is the exploitation of the person and the exploitation of their labor. And there's the goods might have changed, the technology might have changed, but the mentality behind it of treating people like objects is still very present. So this slavery has existed throughout history, and it is still going on today. And so this is kind of showing the past united with the present. So speaking of slavery, let's talk a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade, and I'll go into this a little bit more later. But if we take a look at, if we think for a minute about Africa, and there's the lasting impact of the Atlantic slave trade on today. So if we take a minute to just kind of think about 10 million people were taken from Africa. And that what happened was that erased an entire generation of people out of their own countries. And what happened, as we know, is that erased generations, causing a collapse in economies, because if you think about it, if there's no people to work, they're not putting the money into local economies as the top economies tank, leaving nations vulnerable to conquest and colonization, as we've seen through over the years, which all of this led to warfare and instability. So we know from our own history what happens when the economy tanks or there's warfare. It leaves nations vulnerable. If there's nobody there to protect the nation, and a lot of who was taken there were men and boys that are often in combat. You can kind of see these pieces working together. If there's no one there to secure borders, if there's no one there to fight in a war, there's no way to protect their country from colonization. Well, so I want you to kind of, all these pieces will all come together if you kind of like keep this in the back of your mind for a minute. Okay, we have the Atlantic slave trade. How does this connect to human trafficking? We'll get there. This might seem a little disconnected, but I just want you to kind of hold on to this for a minute and just kind of keep this in the back of your mind, because I will go back to this later on in the presentation. So what exactly is human trafficking? And I'm kind of throwing a lot at you. So so at any time you have a question, you can just pop it into the chat. So the general definition is recruiting, harboring, transporting, or obtaining a person for profit. So what does that look like? Well, it has to have one or all of these conditions. That is under force, fraud, or coercion. So I mentioned the International Labor Organization, their definition. This is also the Department of Labor and the FBI use this language as well. So there has to be a formula in order to define human trafficking. You can think of it as a formula. There has to be a system, right? So there's an act, a means, and the purpose. So the act is through recruitment, transportation, or harboring or receiving a person. The means has to be force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sex, labor, or both. Now, when it comes to children and minors, the conditions, the means doesn't necessarily have to exist because of the age of consent. And there's a belief, like adults can consent to these things. So force, fraud, or coercion has to be present when looking at cases with adults, but with children, that's not so. So what would that look like? So for example, if a child is working in a family restaurant and they're working 18-hour days, it's easy to see that that's a problem because children are supposed to be in school, they're supposed to play, but when adults do it, they can consent to long hours. So it's a little bit harder when adults do it. That's why this language has to have a definition, because if somebody's working long hours, you don't necessarily say that's human trafficking. You can't get arrested for working long hours, or otherwise most of America would be arrested, right? So when we think in these terms of what is human trafficking, it has to have kind of like almost like a math formula. These things have to go together to exploit people. Now, going back to like youth and young adults, another way to look at this is, for example, with exploitation. With sexual exploitation specifically, with like one red flag would be, and a lot of the parents in the room would nod their head like, yes, this is absolutely a red flag. You might see something like a teenage girl is say 16 years old and she has a boyfriend who's 35. You would go, oh, that's a red flag. That's a little weird. And why you might raise that red flag is because there's a power dynamic, right? And there's usually some form of manipulation. because who are traffickers? There are manipulators. And why do people get trafficked is kind of a complicated question to answer, but often it's because they're in a vulnerable position. And anybody at any time, especially now in the pandemic when work is scarce, can be in a vulnerable position, and someone can prey on that. And what ends up happening is they'll offer someone or something that, like a job, for example, or a pathway to citizenship or asylum, and then take the documents from someone. There was a case in Seattle recently that went through our municipal courts where the Seattle PD found a person who was hired as a CPA, as an accountant, and that person, they knew that there was lost wages, like wage fraud. The person wasn't getting paid, but they had applied for a job that seemed legit. But what happened was they turned in their documents to fill out a W-2 and give your social security card over to this person, not knowing that who they were giving their documents over, they were not a legitimate business. They were legitimate enough to make it seem okay in terms of tax purposes. I don't know if that makes sense, but when it boiled down to it, they were able to take that person's documents and keep them, and then say, you have to still work for me, and in order to continue keeping this job, I'm holding onto your documents. And so the person was working in the hopes of getting employment and pay. So it can happen to, I'm not trying to say this to scare people, to say, oh, it can happen to anybody, but it's one of those, I don't want people to think that this only happens in the movies or it only happens in countries over here. It happens in the United States to regular people, typically people who are in a vulnerable situation. So I guess the moral of that story is always do checks on your employers and be mindful of those kind of things. But again, I'm not trying to scare anybody, but just showing that this is something that can happen in any country to any person. And it's not just limited to certain circumstances. So the question I posed earlier is what does an enslaved person look like? This is an example of migrant workers. And a lot of times now in the pandemic, we're calling people essential workers, but the reality is who makes up essential work? A lot of the time it's migrant workers or people that work as seamstress in factories. Sometimes people who are obviously in sexual exploitation or in prostitution, that is a form of human trafficking. But sometimes it's also people who work in the beauty industry or salons, or it could be a child that is a child working in the coffee plantation, or domestic workers. So we might see someone who might work in a hotel and they're a domestic worker. And they might see someone who was working, like I said, as a migrant worker, growing and harvesting our food. It could be someone exploited. It could be someone working in sewing our clothes or making our coffee or making our food. So human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. You might ask, why is this going on if it's illegal? Because it makes money is the short answer, and it makes a lot of money. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in order to make what is causing all of this, it means that there's a lot of, if you remember the slides from before when I talked about Africa, in order for the perfect storm or the perfect conditions for trafficking are things like war and forced migration, because traffickers can take advantage of people fleeing combat zones or forced migration, or fleeing for forced migration. It also is formed by from commodification and treating people like objects. Our society more and more so is increasing this demand. Poverty is a means by which this can exist. And then a demand for cheap labor and goods. So this is the first question that I want to put out in the breakout session. And we'll have about, I guess, 10 minutes to answer this question. So this first question is, how might I be contributing to this system of exploitation and not be aware of it? Oops, I'm sorry. I was trying to capture my question so we could put it in the chat. So let me just stop my share real quick.
I could type it in the chat while you're speaking, Samantha.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there's a question that came in. This is a great question. What would be another $150 billion industry that we could compare by a volume? That's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I think maybe the entertainment industry makes that much money. It's so interwoven into everything that we do. Thank you, Danny. Yes. So the question is in the chat. How might I be contributing to the system of exploitation without being aware of it?
Are you ready for breakout rooms?
Yes. Do you need me to stop my screen share?
Nope, it's fine. So the question's in the breakout in the chat, so you can reference that while you're in the breakout rooms. There's a couple people that joined us a little bit late. Just to acknowledge and welcome you all. We're going to be going into breakout rooms to discuss this question: how might I be contributing to the system of exploitation without being aware of it? And so we'll give you all about 10 minutes. You'll see a little timer on the top right, so you can kind of sense how much time you have. There we go. So weird. There's a I don't know if that was that a comment to somebody else that's maybe sent you a private message on the chat.
If there was a few, just share briefly a few observations, maybe if you felt comfortable sharing with a larger group. Does anyone feel like they want to share?
Roberta, do you want to for our group? Where is she? Well,
Roberta, you're on mute.
oh, I am.
Roberta is.
Oh, is she trying to talk? Okay, well, I'll go. Oh, she's Roberta, are you there?
Yeah, you go ahead, because I'm
Okay, well, we came up with the typical things that probably everybody would come up with. You know, hiring a house cleaner or gardener or something like that. You don't know what their situation is. What a question that we had was, how do you recognize somebody who is being trafficked? Is there a way? Are there signs, signals, you know?
Well, that's a great question. And I also want to pay attention to the remark that you made about the gardener, because when I gave the example of the person who was the accountant, it was such a strange conversation when I went to that training. that's such a great observation, the gardeners, because sometimes when you hire someone, because that's kind of how that situation happened, you're taking the word of a third party that you think that you vetted, and you may not know, because how would sometimes there's no way of knowing like who you might have hired or what purchase, like if you make a purchase, is this a good purchase? So so those are great observations, because that's sometimes how that happens. You mentioned the signs. So sometimes there's visible signs. You don't want to stereotype people, but I gave the example earlier of like kind of red flags. Like sometimes you might see, like, often when it comes to with sexual exploitation of minors, it might be runaways. Again, I don't want to stereotype. Or it might be a situation where someone suddenly has money and they didn't have money before, but they have designer clothes and they have all this, their hair is done, or they have makeup or whatever. And that's not necessarily like, oh, because someone wears makeup and does their hair. I'm talking like they might have looked one way and they're completely different before. And so that could be a sign that there's something wrong. And so I don't recommend like jumping in and trying to help or assist someone, because that often makes things worse for the person who's being trafficked. It could even put them in danger. It's one of those things, like I remember riding a bus one time and I saw this woman running out of a hotel, no shoes on, hardly any clothes. She was like desperate, running for help. And so in the back of my mind, I knew that I could probably make things worse for her, but I kept in my hand a card. Sometimes you can have a card that would say like a trafficking hotline number, and give them to them. And so that's one of those rare situations when you can kind of intervene. But usually the signs are things like somebody is underage and they're with an older person who's like much older than them. They have a bunch of money when they didn't used to have money before. If they're a good student and their grades have slipped tremendously, or and it's just kind of like observing your surroundings and doing a gut check and seeing, is that person being treated well? Is that person safe? Do they look healthy? And if you feel like something might be wrong, it's hard. It's a hard dance when it comes to helping someone. Sometimes you have to just make a phone call to I should have dropped it in the chat, but I can, if anybody wants it, you can contact me because I don't have it offhand. But there's it's a human trafficking hotline number, and you can usually call the tips line or the local police. There's usually a high traffic unit. You could call them and give a tip and say, I saw so-and-so on this street corner or this bus or in this coffee shop, and things look a little bit strange to me. So that's one way. Does anyone have any other questions?
See, Katerina has a hand.
So I always feel like very uneasy when I see parent begging on a corner with the little kids around her, and like I don't want to report it because it's really hard, but I think it's also using the kids for that purposes.
That's one of those situations where if you're not sure, most of the time, if you're not sure about something, don't intervene, and don't judge someone if you can in those situations. If you feel like they might be in danger, then you can probably call a tip line, a professional tip line, and tell someone that you think they might be in danger. But again, it's really it's one of those strange things where it's like if you see someone, you don't want to stereotype, or someone could just be experiencing homelessness. So it's kind of a difficult thing. I can get a little bit more into things that we can do, like action items that we can take towards the end. So I will get back to that, like some practical actions that we can take in a minute. So one way that we participate in this system, and we might not even be aware of it, is through our cell phones. So I'm giving this picture. So on the left-hand side is a woman, she's kind of taking her selfie, and I think most of us have done this at one point or another, having a great day. Maybe she's having a coffee. She's having like, just enjoying her life and not realizing who is doing the labor. Now, the reason why I have these two young boys in a mine on the right-hand side is because there's a lot of mining that happens in African nations that we call conflict minerals, because they've literally caused wars because of the high demand. They're so valuable. If you think of how many times Apple tries to tell you, for example, you need to upgrade your phone, or Samsung or one of these organizations will tell you, you need to upgrade your phone and get the latest and the greatest, because they make so much money doing it, because some of the materials, it's not that they cost so much money, it's just that they're worth so much money, and the labor is not costing them anything. So they're making a high volume profit. Somebody mentioned Jeff Bezos making $100 billion a year. And this is what I'm talking about, this high profit gains off of exploitation. So these are the minerals, tungsten, tin, tantalum, and gold. And I don't have a scientific background, or an engineering background, so I'm not going to bother explaining to you what these minerals do, but I did put in my slide that they're basically the minerals that without them, your Wi-Fi wouldn't work, our laptops wouldn't work, our phones wouldn't work. So we're finding out, oh, we need Zoom a lot, or we need our cell phones a lot since we can't be in person because of the pandemic. So there's an increase in the demand for these things, more so now than ever before. So the reason why I mentioned the Atlantic slave trade, and I said, we'll have to think about this later, and why I brought up these minerals is because of this map here. So if we take a look at this map, so the darkest colors over here, like where we are in the US, is 100% usage. We use the most technology of any other country. We're like one of the highest users. The US and Canada and some of these wealthier nations like Australia, UK, Western Europe are the highest users of this technology. And the ones with like the fainted colors, like take a look at Africa, they are the lowest usage of technology. But that's where those minerals are coming from. That's where the most like the conflict minerals and that type of that form of trafficking is taking place. And the reason why I brought up the Atlantic slave trade is the same place where they took people and brought them to the American and British colonies. For the Atlantic slave trade is the same places where the exploitation is the highest amount of exploitation going on. And if we look at the United States and look a little bit closer, the people that are being exploited and trafficked at the highest rates are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so you can see like the parallel between the wealthiest nations, who's using the most technology, who's exploiting the most, and from where. And so that's what I meant by the effects of slavery are still being lived out today, and the systems that were built out from them. So the big question and why we're gathered here is what we feel a call, a response from our faith that says we have to do something because we've been called by God to respond to the needs of the world. So what does the church say? So Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, his encyclical that was actually about the environment, but proving that all these things are interconnected. He says human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture, which is now spreading. So we've treated people in the same way that we have with disposable garbage. And because of this consumerism, we consume more, we end up throwing things more, we end up purchasing more, and then it increases the demand and also has a huge environmental impact as well. So it's doing multiple things at once. In Gaudium et Spes, one of the most foundational documents of our Catholic social teaching that came out of Second Vatican Council says, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons, all these things and others of their like are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than those who suffer from injury. Moreover, they are supreme dishonor to the Creator. And that's one of our foundational teachings. And last, I want to share this part. So let's see, hold on. The seventh commandment forbids or enterprises that for any reason, selfish or ideological, commercial or totalitarian, lead to the enslavement of human beings to their being bought, sold, and exchanged for like merchandise in disregard for their personal dignity. It is a sin against the dignity of persons and their fundamental right to reduce them by violence to their productive value or to a source of profit. St. Paul directed a Christian master to treat his Christian slave no longer as slave, but more than a slave, as beloved brother, both in flesh and in the Lord. And that's directly out of the Catechism, paragraph 214. So these are just three examples of many documents that we have as foundational pieces of our teachings of our church. And so in these three documents that were written in three different times are showing this over and over again how human trafficking takes away the inherent dignity of both the person being trafficked and the person doing the trafficking, because of it, like I mentioned earlier, because of this exploitation and treating people like objects. Danny, how is our time?
I have another meeting at 7, but we have 6 minutes till 7. So I don't know, up to you if you want to do another.
Okay. So I want to be mindful of people's time because I had these last 3 questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to get through all of them. But let's see, we can at least address.
What if you were going to mention some direct actions that folks can take? Maybe we do that, and then we can send these questions as like personal reflection questions.
That works. Okay. That works. So what can we do? So I apologize that I'm kind of like running out of time, but I can send out the discussion questions. So thank you for being part of this rich conversation. So here are some of my ideas. So one of the things that I mentioned that we can do, because human trafficking contributes to all of these different things. We talked about race, economics, human dignity, even climate. And so one of the things you can do is, rather than investing in just blindly investing into the companies, these huge corporations, we can give money and invest in Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, whether we're purchasing from BIPOC-owned businesses or putting money back into those communities so that there is a circulation and distribution of economic distribution and wealth. I mentioned this is very much a racial issue, so we can be actively anti-racist, and what that means is just doing the work to understand our own complicity in these systems. A major thing is not consuming exploitive content, and I gave the example of porn, but there's anything from abusive content, abusive media, movies, like really taking an inventory of, is this good for my soul, myself, or is this exploiting, contributing to the exploitation of other people? And is this putting money into an industry that's ultimately hurting or devaluing people? Another thing is we can make corporations accountable by demanding transparency. And what I mean by that is ordinary citizens have been able to use their voice to change legislations by writing their elected officials and demanding that laws be changed. People have written and changed consumer laws that demands corporate social responsibility, with the Dodd-Frank law that was put into place by people voicing their opinion and saying, Hershey's, can you make your chocolate fair trade? Or Amazon, can you implement worker rights? Things of that nature. So use your voice and speak out in that way. Ask yourself before you make a purchase, because a lot of this is resting on labor trafficking, right? So do I need this purchase? Is this purchase ethically made or sourced? Can this purchase wait? Often we increase the demand for cheap goods because we're constantly buying things, right? If I buy this, can I buy this at a store that is local, putting money back into our local community? Is it sustainable? Will it be healthy for me, for my community, for the earth? Will I have it for a long time? Is it an ethical purchase? And is this purchase, like I mentioned earlier, is this putting money back into Black, Indigenous, and people in communities of color? Is this business upholding people, or is it upholding profit in large corporations? So those are some of the ideas that I had. If you have any more questions or comments, you can send them to me. I want to close out quickly, if we have time for a prayer. I'd like to pray this prayer from this is from Catholic Relief Services, and the next slide has my contact information. So we close out this night for a prayer to end human trafficking. Oh God, we didn't see them, but you did. The hundreds and thousands of human beings trafficked each year to join the millions who are trapped in modern day slavery. Under terrible conditions, they work in factories, plow fields, harvest crops, work quarries, fill brothels, clean homes, and haul water. Many are children with tiny fingers for weaving rugs and small shoulders for bearing rifles. Their labor is forced, their bodies beaten, their faces hidden from those who don't really want to see them, but you see them, God of the poor. You hear their cry, and you answer by opening our eyes and breaking our hearts and loosening our tongues to insist no more. So thank you, everyone. And if you have questions, this is my email address, and I'd be more than happy to answer whatever questions that you have.
Yes, thank you, Samantha. And as soon as Samantha shares with me those breakout room questions, I will definitely forward them to you sometime this week so that you can use them for your own personal reflection as you discern actions you can take. Given this month, there still be at least one more opportunity for continuing to learn more, specifically about kind of this increase of online use and technology because of the pandemic with our children who are doing more and more online learning. And so if you are interested in this topic and you want to continue learning more on this issue, I invite you to the Keeping Kids Safe Online presentation by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children on January 7th at 6 p.m. And I'm going to share the link with you in the email after this, but also in the chat right now. And then I wasn't planning on sharing this until Samantha noted the intersection with race and how this connects with racial justice. We are going to have an event on racial unity in February. So I'm going to just post that link also in the chat and the email that I'll send either tomorrow or later this week. But just for more opportunities for us to learn and grow in our awareness of this issue and just how it connects more broadly to other social topics. And then lastly, as social justice coordinator, I'm always looking for people to step up and who want to, form small groups or small action teams. If you feel God is planting that in your heart and tugging you to do something a little bit more intentionally and concretely, please reach out and let's have a conversation and see where the Spirit takes us. So with that, thank you all. Thank you, Samantha, for your time and your wisdom. And we'll keep in touch with more resources and information.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.